Catalina Island sits about 22 miles off the coast of Southern California. On a clear day you can see it from the mainland, a long, narrow ridge of land rising out of the Pacific. Most people know it as a tourist destination. Ferries run daily. Visitors come for the water, the wildlife, the small town of Avalon with its casino, ballroom, and harbor. It has been that way for about 100 years. But before the tourism, before the Wrigley family purchased it in 1919, before the Hollywood crowd made it a weekend escape, the island had a much longer and far less documented history, one that researchers, archaeologists, and amateur historians have been trying to piece together for well over a century. What makes Catalina worth examining is not any single dramatic claim. It is the accumulation of recurring details that show up across multiple sources, multiple time periods, and multiple excavations. The same kinds of observations made by different people, in different decades, working independently of one another, keep reappearing. That pattern alone is worth paying attention to. The island was home to the Tongva people, also known as the Gabrielino, for thousands of years before European contact. Spanish explorers arrived in 1542 when Juan Rodriguez Cabrillo landed and documented the presence of a settled, organized population. Later expeditions confirmed ongoing habitation. By the time American settlers began arriving in the 1800s, the indigenous population had been dramatically reduced through disease, forced relocation, and displacement. The physical record of their presence, however, remained in the ground. Archaeological interest in Catalina began seriously in the late 1800s and accelerated through the early 20th century. Several expeditions were conducted, some formally, some less so. What they found prompted questions that were never fully resolved. Not because the evidence was ambiguous, but because the documentation surrounding it became increasingly difficult to follow. Reports were filed and then became hard to locate. Institutions that were involved became vague about the extent of their participation. Artifacts that were catalogued appeared to move without clear records of transfer. None of that is unusual in isolation. Archaeological record-keeping in the early 20th century was inconsistent across the board. Institutions operated differently then. Standards for documentation, chain of custody, and public disclosure were not what they are today. That context matters and should not be ignored. But Catalina is not just one site with one gap. It is a location where the gaps appear repeatedly, across different expeditions, different decades, and different institutions. And the physical discoveries that preceded those gaps were, by the accounts of the people who made them, genuinely unusual. The island's geography plays a role in this story. Its isolation made it difficult to monitor. For long stretches of its history, access was controlled by private ownership. From 1919 until relatively recently, the Wrigley family and later the Catalina Island Conservancy managed what happened on the land. That is not presented here as evidence of anything. It is simply a fact that shaped what was accessible, when, and to whom. What we are going to do in this video is walk through what was actually found, who found it, what they said about it at the time, and where the record becomes harder to follow. We are not here to tell you what to conclude. We are here to show you what the documented record contains, where it holds together, and where it does not, and to ask the questions that the evidence itself raises. That is where we start. The first thing to understand about the archaeological discoveries on Catalina Island is that they were not made by fringe researchers or enthusiasts working outside any institutional framework. The early excavations were conducted by or in connection with recognized academic and scientific institutions. The people doing the digging kept notes. They wrote reports. They measured what they found. And what they recorded was, in several instances, genuinely outside what was considered typical for the region. Ralph Glidden is the name most associated with Catalina's excavation history. He was not a credentialed academic archaeologist in the formal sense, but he worked in connection with the Museum of the American Indian in New York, which was a legitimate and well-funded institution at the time. Between roughly 1919 and the late 1920s, Glidden conducted extensive excavations across the island. By his own records, he excavated several thousand burial sites. The number he cited most often was in the range of 3,800 individual graves across the island and surrounding areas. That figure has been questioned, but it has never been systematically disproven either. What is not in question is that the excavations were large in scale and produced a significant volume of physical material. Among the materials documented were skeletal remains. This is where the record becomes particularly detailed and where the questions begin. Glidden documented and in several cases photographed skeletal remains that he described as unusually large. He recorded skull measurements and long bone lengths that he claimed were significantly above the average range for the indigenous populations of the region. He was not the only one to note this. Other researchers who examined the same or similar remains from the island and from the broader Channel Islands region made comparable observations during the same period. The measurements Glidden recorded for certain skeletal remains indicated heights that, if accurate, would range from around 7 feet to over 7.5 feet. These figures appear in his own notes, and in correspondence associated with his work. They were not widely publicized, and they were not incorporated into the mainstream academic literature on California's indigenous populations in any substantial way. Whether that absence reflects a judgment about the reliability of the measurements, or something else, is a question the record does not clearly answer. What the record does show is that Glidden believed he had found something significant enough to document carefully and to bring to the attention of the institutions he was working with. His photographs, some of which have survived and circulated in research contexts, show skeletal remains laid out for documentation purposes alongside measuring tools. The scale visible in those photographs is consistent with his written descriptions, though photographs of this kind are not conclusive measurements, and should not be treated as such. Beyond the size question, the burial sites themselves had features worth noting. Many of the graves Glidden documented showed evidence of intentional, organized burial practices. Bodies were interred with artifacts, tools, ornamental objects, materials that indicated deliberate placement rather than informal disposal. This is not unusual for indigenous burial sites in California. What was noted as unusual was the density of the burial sites in certain areas of the island, the depth of some of the interments, and the presence of what Glidden and others described as an unusually high proportion of individuals with the physical characteristics he was documenting. The Smithsonian Institution enters this part of the record as well. Correspondence from the period indicates communication between Glidden and Smithsonian-affiliated researchers regarding the remains and what should be done with them. The nature of that communication, and what came out of it in terms of any formal institutional involvement, or transfer of materials, is an area where the record becomes less clear. There are references to materials being sent, examined, and assessed. There is considerably less clarity about what conclusions were drawn, and what happened to the physical materials afterward. The Museum of the American Indian, which operated under the direction of George High, also received materials from Glidden's excavations. The High Foundation's collection eventually became part of what is now the National Museum of the American Indian, which is administered by the Smithsonian. The transfer and cataloging of materials through that process was extensive and, by many accounts, inconsistently documented. Items that entered the High collection during this period are not always traceable through a clean chain of custody. Other physical observations from the island during this period include the documentation of what appear to be semi-permanent or permanent structures in certain locations. Stone arrangements and foundations were noted in expedition records, though the extent of formal documentation on these features is limited. The island also yielded significant quantities of artifacts, including tools made from materials not native to the island, which implies sustained trade relationships or movement of people across considerable distances. None of these observations, taken individually, is without a possible conventional explanation. Large skeletal remains can result from a range of natural factors. Dense burial sites can reflect long periods of habitation in a confined geographic area. Artifacts made from non-local materials are consistent with known trade networks in the region. The question is not whether each observation has a possible explanation. The question is whether the pattern they form together, combined with the way the documentation surrounding them was handled, adds up to something that deserves more careful examination than it has received. By the early 1930s, active excavation on Catalina had largely stopped. The island was under consolidated private ownership. Access was controlled. The period of intensive fieldwork that had characterized the 1910s and 1920s was over. What remained was a body of documentation that was incomplete in ways that researchers have been noting ever since. Understanding what was found on Catalina requires understanding who was involved in finding it and what institutional relationships shaped how that information was handled. This is not about assigning motives. It is about following the documented record to see whose hands the evidence passed through, and at what points the paper trail becomes harder to follow. Ralph Glidden remains the central figure. He arrived on Catalina in the years following World War I and established himself as the primary excavator on the island during a period when no formal regulatory framework governed archaeological work in California the way it does today. The Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act, which now governs how indigenous remains and funerary objects are handled, was not passed until 1990. In the 1920s, the legal and ethical landscape around excavation was entirely different. Individuals could and did conduct large-scale digs with relatively little oversight. Glidden eventually opened a small museum on the island where he displayed some of what he had found. Visitors could pay to see artifacts and remains. This was not uncommon for the era. Other private collectors and excavators operated similarly across the American West. What is notable about Glidden is the scale of what he claimed to have found and the specific nature of the physical observations he recorded. He was not a sensationalist by the standards of his time. He was methodical enough to keep measurements, to photograph his work, and to maintain correspondence with established institutions. That does not make his records infallible, but it does mean they deserve to be engaged with seriously rather than dismissed. The Wrigley family's purchase of Catalina in 1919 created a new layer of authority over the island. William Wrigley Jr., the chewing gum magnate, acquired the island and invested heavily in developing it as a tourist destination. The Wrigleys controlled access to the island for decades. Archaeological work during the period of their ownership would have required either their permission or their indifference. The record does not show active obstruction of Glidden's work during the early years. But the consolidation of ownership over an archaeologically significant site under a single private entity is a structural fact worth noting when trying to understand why the documentation record is as incomplete as it is. The Smithsonian's connection to Catalina during this period is documented but not extensively. There are references in archival materials to Smithsonian-affiliated researchers being aware of Glidden's findings and to some level of correspondence about them. What is harder to establish is whether any formal Smithsonian expedition was conducted on Catalina, whether any materials were formally transferred to Smithsonian collections, and if so, what became of them within those collections. Researchers who have tried to trace this thread have found it difficult to follow cleanly. That could reflect the normal archival challenges of working with early 20th century institutional records. It could also reflect something about how the material was categorized or filed. The record does not resolve this clearly. The Museum of the American Indians' involvement is better documented in one direction than the other. It is reasonably well established that Glidden had a relationship with the High Foundation and that materials from his excavations moved into that collection. What is less clear is the full scope of what was transferred and under what terms. George High was an aggressive collector who acquired indigenous artifacts and remains from across North America, often with minimal documentation of provenance. The Catalina materials, to the extent they entered his collection, would have been subject to the same cataloging practices that have made the High collection difficult for researchers to fully audit. By the time the High Foundation's holdings were transferred to the Smithsonian and became the basis of the National Museum of the American Indian, the collection was enormous and the documentation was uneven. Tracing specific items back to specific excavation sites requires the kind of detailed cross-referencing that is both time-consuming and frequently inconclusive. This is a systemic challenge with early 20th century collections, not a problem unique to Catalina. But it does mean that the physical materials Glidden documented may be present in institutional collections in a form that is currently difficult to connect back to their point of origin. Academic archaeology during this period was also operating under frameworks that shaped what was considered worth studying and reporting. The prevailing models of North American prehistory in the 1920s left limited room for findings that did not fit established narratives about the populations that had inhabited the continent. Observations that appeared anomalous were not always incorporated into mainstream literature. They were sometimes noted in field reports and personal correspondence, and then not carried forward into published scholarship. That is a pattern visible across the discipline during this period, not a dynamic specific to Catalina. What all of this adds up to is a situation where the people who made the observations were documenting them, but the institutional pathways through which those observations would normally have been validated, debated, and either confirmed or challenged did not function cleanly in this case. The record shows activity, correspondence, and movement of materials. It does not show a clear resolution. There is a particular kind of historical gap that is more telling than simple absence. It is the gap that follows a period of documented activity where you can see that something was happening, that people were paying attention, that materials were moving, and then the record becomes thin precisely at the point where you would expect it to become more detailed. That is the pattern on Catalina Island. Glidden's excavation work was active and documented through the 1920s. He was keeping records, corresponding with institutions, and operating a museum. Then, moving into the 1930s, the intensity of that activity drops sharply in the record. The museum eventually closed. Glidden himself fades from the documented archaeological conversation around Catalina. The materials he had accumulated, thousands of artifacts and remains by his own account, do not have a clean documented trail showing where they went and in what condition. Some of this can be explained by circumstances that have nothing to do with any deliberate effort to suppress information. The Great Depression disrupted institutional funding across the board. Private collectors lost resources. Museums scaled back acquisitions and operations. Glidden was not a wealthy man and would have been subject to the same financial pressures as everyone else operating in that environment. The closure of his island museum could simply reflect economic reality rather than anything more pointed. But the economic explanation does not fully account for what happened to the physical materials. Large collections of archaeological material do not simply disappear without some kind of documented transfer, sale, dispersal, or loss. The normal expectation would be that a collection of the scale Glidden described would leave a traceable institutional footprint: acquisition records, donation receipts, purchase agreements, correspondence about storage. That footprint is remarkably faint for a collection of this reported size. Researchers who have tried to locate the skeletal remains Glidden specifically documented as unusual, the ones with the measurements that fell outside the normal range, have found that trail particularly difficult to follow. There are references to materials being examined by outside researchers. There are suggestions in correspondence of institutional interest. There is not a clean documented record of where those specific remains ended up, whether they were formally studied, and what conclusions, if any, were drawn from that study. The Smithsonian's record on this is incomplete in a way that is worth describing carefully. The institution holds enormous collections from this period, and not all of them are fully digitized or indexed in ways that allow easy external access. The absence of easily locatable records about Catalina materials and Smithsonian holdings does not necessarily mean those records do not exist. It may mean they have not been indexed in a way that makes them findable through normal research channels. It may mean they are filed under categories or collection names that do not obviously connect to Catalina. What it does not mean definitively is that materials were received and then deliberately made inaccessible. That interpretation goes beyond what the record allows. What the record does allow is the observation that several researchers over several decades who have attempted to trace this material have encountered consistent difficulty. That consistency is itself a data point. It does not prove anything about intent. But it does suggest that the documentation surrounding these particular materials and these particular findings did not follow the normal pathways that would make them accessible to subsequent researchers. There is also a gap in the academic literature that is worth noting. The findings Glidden documented, particularly the skeletal measurements, never received serious published treatment in the mainstream archaeological literature of the period. This was the 1920s and 1930s, a time when the field was actively debating questions about the peopling of the Americas and the physical characteristics of early North American populations. Findings of the kind Glidden described, if they had been validated by institutional researchers, would have been significant enough to generate published discussion. The absence of that discussion could mean the findings were examined and found unreliable. It could also mean they were not examined in a rigorous institutional context at all. The record does not clearly distinguish between those two possibilities. By the mid-20th century, Catalina Island had been firmly established in the public mind as a recreational destination. The archaeological history of the island was not a prominent part of that identity. The Catalina Island Conservancy, which eventually took over stewardship of much of the island's land from the Wrigley family interests, has conducted and supported archaeological work in more recent decades. That work has produced documentation about the island's indigenous history that is consistent with the broader regional picture. It has not, in any published form, returned substantively to the specific questions raised by the Glidden-era findings. That could mean those questions have been answered to the satisfaction of the researchers involved and the answers simply confirmed conventional expectations. It could mean the questions have not been prioritized. It could mean the physical materials necessary to revisit those questions are not readily available in a form that would allow new analysis. Any of those explanations is possible. None of them is clearly supported or clearly ruled out by what the documented record currently shows. After walking through the physical observations, the documented history, the institutional connections, and the gaps in the record, the honest position is that Catalina Island leaves you with a set of open questions rather than a set of answers. That is not a failure of the research. It is what the evidence actually produces when you follow it carefully and resist the temptation to fill in the spaces with conclusions the record does not support. Here is what the record does show. There were extensive excavations on Catalina Island during the 1920s, conducted at scale, by an individual who maintained correspondence with recognized institutions and who kept detailed enough records that his work can still be partially reconstructed nearly 100 years later. Those excavations produced physical material, including skeletal remains, that the excavator described as anomalous in specific and measurable ways. That description was detailed enough to include measurements and photographs. The institutional response to those findings was, at minimum, muted. The physical materials did not follow a clean documented path into accessible institutional collections. The mainstream academic literature of the period did not engage with the findings in any substantive published form. And subsequent attempts by researchers to trace either the materials or the institutional response have consistently run into incomplete records. None of that is fabricated. All of it is drawn from the documented record, with the appropriate acknowledgement that the record is itself incomplete and that incompleteness limits what conclusions can be drawn from it. What the record does not show is deliberate suppression. The gap between "the record is incomplete" and "someone made the record incomplete on purpose" is significant, and it is a gap that the available evidence does not bridge. Incomplete records from this period are the norm, not the exception. Institutions in the early 20th century did not maintain documentation to modern standards. Collections were acquired, moved, miscatalogued, and lost through entirely ordinary processes. Researchers working in this period were operating within disciplinary frameworks that shaped what they paid attention to and what they did not. All of those factors can produce the pattern we see in the Catalina record without requiring any deliberate effort to conceal anything. At the same time, the pattern is consistent enough and the specific findings unusual enough that the default response of simply not engaging with them does not seem adequate either. If the skeletal measurements Glidden recorded were examined and found to be inaccurate, or the result of misidentification or error, that conclusion should be somewhere in the record. The absence of a documented rebuttal is not the same as validation of the original claims, but it is also not nothing. The Channel Islands more broadly have been the site of significant archaeological discoveries in recent decades that have revised earlier assumptions about the timeline and nature of human habitation on the California coast. The discovery of Arlington Springs Man on Santa Rosa Island pushed the confirmed date of human presence in the region back to approximately 13,000 years. That discovery, made in the 1960s and confirmed with more precise dating in the 1990s, demonstrated that the Channel Islands had been inhabited far earlier than previously assumed and that the people who lived there had navigational and cultural capabilities that earlier models had underestimated. That context does not validate Glidden's specific claims, but it does establish that the Channel Islands have repeatedly produced findings that required revisions to earlier frameworks. Catalina, in that regional context, is an island with a long, dense, and not fully understood human history. The questions about what was found there in the 1920s, where it went, and why the record surrounding it is as thin as it is remain open. They are not resolved by dismissing Glidden as unreliable, because his reliability was never formally tested in the institutional record. They are not resolved by accepting his measurements at face value, because those measurements were never independently verified in a documented way. They sit in the space between, where a lot of genuinely interesting historical questions live. The purpose of this video has been to show you what the documented record contains and where it becomes harder to follow, not to tell you what to think about it. The archaeology of Catalina Island is a subject that rewards careful attention, skepticism applied evenly in both directions, and a willingness to sit with questions that do not have clean answers. If you have looked at the same evidence presented here and reached a different interpretation, that is exactly how this kind of material should be engaged with. The record is incomplete. The questions are real. And the island is still there.